meet up with the lacrimal nerve. Okay, and then there's also other postganglionics going to different targets, different glands, palatine glands, etc., in the midface. So, additionally, you'll have postganglionic sympathetics in a nerve called the deep petrosal nerve, okay, which will also enter the pterygoid canal. And at that point, where the preganglionic parasympathetics meet up with the postganglionic sympathetics, you have a nerve that changes its name to the nerve of the pterygoid canal, or sometimes called the Vidian nerve in older anatomy textbooks. So this is the nerve of the pterygoid canal, which again will communicate with other target structures. Okay, so that's V2. V2 sensory territory on the face, like I said, was the midface here, sort of below the palpebral fissure right here, and then gets the lateral part of the nose. All of the upper dentition receives somatosensory innervation from V2, and the upper lip as well. Okay. Here are what the approximate locations of the terminal V2 branches on the face that you should be able to see. Zygomaticotemporal nerve here, laterally, the zygomaticofacial nerve by the orbit, and the infraorbital nerve, the most conspicuous of these, just below the orbit, as the name would suggest. Okay, and so again, here are some more realistic depictions of these nerves. So the maxillary division here below V1, going through the foramen rotundum, giving rise to these alveolar nerves. First, you have these posterior superior alveolar nerves, which will go to the posterior maxillary dentition. That zygomatic nerve, which will split on the face. This big infraorbital nerve here, sort of running on the floor of the orbit, will give rise to these middle superior alveolar nerves, which will go to the premolars, maxillary premolars, and finally terminating in these anterior superior alveolar nerves for the anterior maxillary dentition. Okay. Here's another view of the same thing. So we can see the alveolar nerves going towards the roots of the maxillary dentition here, the posterior, the middle, and finally the anterior. Okay, all off of the infraorbital nerve, by the way, itself, a branch of V2. Here's that communicating twig to V1 for the lacrimal gland. Here are the two branches from the zygomatic nerve. So the zygomatic nerve will split into the zygomaticotemporal and zygomaticofacial nerves. There's the approximate location of the pterygopalatine ganglion, which we won't see for a while. I don't know when that dissection is. But you can see it's connected to sort of the main stalk of V2 by these two twigs right here. And then descending from the ganglion are those greater and lesser palatine nerves going inferiorly here to reach the palate. And so here we take another look, this time from the medial aspect in the nasal cavity. And you can see the ganglion. And then here you can see a bunch of nasal branches, in this case posterior lateral nasal branches to provide sensory innervation to the nasal cavity here. The palatine nerves going inferiorly from the ganglion. The one that will go anterior towards the hard palate will be the greater. The one that goes posteriorly towards the soft palate, the lesser palatine nerves. The nasopalatine nerve, like I said earlier, will go towards the incisive canal and emerge just behind, just posterior to the anterior dentition. And we have a little pharyngeal branch right here posteriorly. So here's the same thing, just with the mucosa sort of overlaid onto the bone. But again, you have the same sort of configuration here with these nasal, posterior lateral nasal nerves and the palatine nerves, etc. And if you look on the palate itself, you can see these will go anteriorly, these posteriorly through these foramina back here. And finally, the nasopalatine nerve so here you can see sort of the sensory territories of V1, V2, and this paler green, and V3 down here we'll talk about a little bit, which gets part of the tongue. And again, more of the same here. Sort of a weird view. So why do we care about branches of V2, of the maxillary nerve? Well, as future dentists, you're going to be dealing with a lot of tooth pain, obviously, and the alveolar nerves are innervating the upper teeth, the maxillary teeth, and so if you need to perform procedures on the maxillary teeth, you need to anesthetize these nerves. And you can see here, if you want to block the anterior superior alveolar nerve, you will administer the injection just lateral to the canine here. In the case of the middle superior alveolar nerve block, you'll go lateral to the premolars to knock out those nerves. And finally, a posterior superior alveolar nerve block will go lateral to the molars. This is different in the lower dentition, and you'll see why in the mandibular dentition, but there's a lot of nerves, there's a lot of different nerves that innervate maxillary dentition. If you need to anesthetize the mucosa over the hard palate, you go medial to the molar, to the third molar here to knock out the greater palatine nerve. And then finally, to anesthetize this sort of primary part of the hard palate, you go knock out the nasopalatine nerve, which you should know is down near that incisive canal. For surgeries of the midface or the upper lip, you'll want to knock out the infraorbital nerve, again by going sort of superiorly through the lip there. So that brings us to the third chapter here, the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, which again, I remind you, is sensory and motor in nature. So you have sensation sort of in and around the mandible and sort of the lateral face here. The skin of the temporal region, part of the earlobe as well. And all the sensory innervation of the lower dentition, this time in a simpler configuration, just one nerve, the inferior alveolar nerve. It's all of the lower dentition. It also supplies motor to this list of muscles right here. So the temporalis, the medial and lateral pterygoid, and the masseter make up the chewing muscles. And then there's some other muscles which we're already familiar with, the anterior part of the digastric, the mylohyoid, and then some we'll see later, this tensor veli palatini and tensor tympani muscles also receive innervation from V3. So here goes again. Same sort of configuration here. Now it'll be more complicated because we'll have more motor going on in here. We'll have somatic motor as well as autonomic motor. And so you have this sort of layout, general layout of the mandibular division, a very complicated nerve. But again, we start very simply, just with the immediate branch going through foramen ovale, so it heads down inferiorly. It'll give rise to a couple nerves. It'll give rise to this buccal nerve, not to be confused with the buccal branch of the facial nerve, which is a motor nerve, but the buccal nerve is a sensory nerve to the cheek. There's also this very important nerve, which you'll definitely see when we do the infratemporal fossa, the auriculotemporal nerve, which is another sensory nerve. And it is a very classic relationship where it sort of wraps around this artery in the infratemporal fossa called the middle meningeal artery, which goes through foramen spinosum, by the way. Another piece of this nerve, sort of the majority of it, will go down through the mandibular foramen, and that'll be called the inferior alveolar nerve, which again is that nerve of sensory innervation to the mandibular teeth. And then after that, it will exit anteriorly through the mental foramen and change its name to the mental nerve. Okay, you'll definitely see that today in lab. Anterior to this nerve, so anterior to the inferior alveolar nerve, there's this big lingual nerve, which, as the name suggests, will go towards the tongue and provide to the tongue general sensation to its anterior 2/3. Okay. So these are the sensory branches of V3. The motor part of V3 contains these branches to the chewing muscles and these tensor muscles over here, and a bunch of chewing muscles right here. So there's a motor contribution. There's also a longer nerve that will go down, the nerve tympanohyoid, which will, as you can see, ride with the inferior alveolar nerve, but just before the inferior alveolar nerve dives into the mandibular foramen, the nerve tympanohyoid will escape and go towards those suprahyoid muscles, the mylohyoid and the anterior digastric. Also traveling with V3 are some preganglionic parasympathetics, this time from the glossopharyngeal nerve. So the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 9, communicates with a third parasympathetic ganglion, the otic ganglion, which exists just inferior to the foramen ovale. So just below foramen ovale, you have another parasympathetic ganglion of the head. So these will synapse here, and then postganglionics from the otic ganglion will travel with the auriculotemporal nerve. It's the important part of that story there. And then we'll head towards the parotid gland on the cheek to produce saliva. Okay. Moreover, so that's one of the two parasympathetic ganglia that are suspended from V3. There's another one, the submandibular ganglion, which is innervating the submandibular and sublingual glands. So we removed like the superficial part of this submandibular gland last week to see the submandibular triangle better. So that's communicating with cranial nerve 7 again through this different branch. So Dr. Wilbur will talk about this on Wednesday, but the facial nerve is also pretty complicated in that it has two parasympathetic pieces. It has that greater petrosal nerve, which we already talked about, and it also has this other branch, chorda tympani, which also carries parasympathetic fibers. And so this one communicates with the submandibular ganglion, which again innervate these submandibular and sublingual salivary producing glands. But also it carries the special sensation of taste to the tongue. Okay, you can taste with the tongue because of the fibers in the chorda tympani, not because of fibers in the trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve is only providing the general sensation. However, the lingual nerve, as you can see here, carries general sensation from V3, but also running with it is chorda tympani that provides that taste to the same region, the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. The parasympathetic fibers will not go to the tongue. They'll go to this ganglion inferior to the tongue and then reach their target glands after that. So we'll take a look at this again in some more true-to-life pictures.
Question?
Yeah.
Is there a question? Do you like?
Yep.
Is chorda tympani go through the ganglion or no?
Chorda tympani will emerge in the infratemporal fossa and join up with the lingual nerve. So yeah, it looks, it does not, but it looks like that in this picture. Yeah, but it will not go. Certainly, the taste fibers don't have anything to do with that ganglion, but the parasympathetic fibers will go to that ganglion to synapse. Yeah, again from the facial nerve. Any other questions? So here is the mandibular nerve, V3, exiting through foramen ovale. Here we see the auriculotemporal nerve, which will get some of the skin in front of the ear. Here you see that important relationship where this nerve wraps around the middle meningeal artery right here, which is going up to supply the dura. It's going up through foramen spinosum, and then this nerve encounters it and sort of wraps around as it continues upward. Buccal nerve towards the cheek for sensory innervation. And then here's that big inferior alveolar nerve, which is going to go to the mandibular dentition. And you can see attached to it, running with it, is that little nerve to mylohyoid, which is going to go to the mylohyoid muscle down here and the anterior belly of the digastric muscle right there. The inferior alveolar nerve, after it exits through the mental foramen, will change its name to the mental nerve. The lingual nerve, anterior to the inferior alveolar nerve, you can see hanging off of it is that ganglion right there, that submandibular ganglion. So it's suspended from these twigs on the lingual nerve. Okay. Another view of essentially the same thing. You can see the inferior alveolar nerve in the mandibular foramen through the mandibular canal, giving twigs to the roots of all the mandibular dentition. You can also see little twigs to the chewing muscles here as well. Another illustration of the same thing. Buccal nerve coming off here towards the cheek. Here you see better the relationship of the inferior alveolar nerve posterior to the lingual nerve, which is right here. And again, you see that nerve to mylohyoid not entering that mandibular foramen, but going down to those suprahyoid muscles. There's the lingual nerve, which becomes very splayed out in the oral cavity. And again, here another picture with the mandible removed to better illustrate that nerve to mylohyoid going down here, the submandibular ganglion right there, receiving its parasympathetics that we're running with the chorda tympani, which is right here. So the chorda tympani will join up with the lingual nerve in the infratemporal fossa. So when we dissect this region next week, you should be able to see a tiny little nerve coming from deep posteriorly that will meet up with the lingual nerve and then relay those parasympathetics to the submandibular gland. Yeah?
You said that there's pre-ganglionic parasympathetic nerves from the chorda tympani to the submandibular ganglia.
Yes.
Then it synapses